Views expressed are not endorsed by the United States Department of Defense or its components.
Welcome back to the Flyover Podcast as part of USAFA Aviation. With us today, we have Captain Jimmy Owenby.
Hello.
Captain Jimmy Owenby is a TG-16 flight instructor at the 70th Flight Training Squadron at the United States Air Force Academy, Colorado. He instructs cadets and cadet instructors in airmanship programs preparing future leaders and aviators in the Air Force.
Captain Owenby transferred to the Air Force Reserves in August of 2023 from the Army Reserves. He received his commission from the through Officer Candidate School in 2015, completing UH-60 flight training in 2016 at Fort Novosel, Alabama. After flight school, he led a UH-60 platoon for the Arizona Army National Guard out of Papago Army Heliport, Phoenix, Arizona. In 2018, he was selected to attend the Accelerated Army Fixed-Wing Training Program and flew the C-12 Huron as the Battalion Assistant Intelligence Officer for the Army Reserves at Los Alamitos Army Airfield, Los Alamitos, California. In 2020, he was selected as a platoon leader and attended the UC-35 Advanced Qualification Course at Dobbins Air Base, Georgia. Prior to his current position, Captain Owenby was a commander, UC-35 Jet Detachment, Ali Al Salem Air Base, Kuwait. Captain Owenby was sent as a liaison officer to Texas during the rescue and recovery efforts after Hurricane Harvey in 2017. In 2019, he participated in Operation Cryptic Dragon at Kadena Air Base, Japan, as an intelligence officer for Army fixed-wing operations in the East Pacific. In 2022, he deployed to Kuwait as commander of the UC-35 Jet Detachment, providing essential DV transportation through the CENTCOM AOR.
Captain Owenby holds undergraduate and graduate degrees in aeronautical sciences, emphasizing safety systems from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. Post-graduation, Captain Owenby has worked for Embry-Riddle as a flight instructor, standards pilot, and adjunct professor. He interned for and was subsequently hired by the National Transportation Safety Board in their co-op program. Captain Owenby flew for a regional airline and led the implementation of their safety management system before joining the Army National Guard. Currently on the civilian side, Captain Owenby is a flight instructor in the Boeing 737 aircraft for Legacy Airline. Thanks for being here, sir. I'm really excited for this.
Thanks for the invite. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. And so I guess we'll just jump right into the flying career. So what were some challenges that you faced while serving as a UC-35 pilot in Kuwait?
Probably I would say the biggest thing is going country to country had different procedures. So mainly diplomatic clearances going back and forth. I'll give you a perfect example. We flew to a different country in CENTCOM one afternoon, and there's flight diplomatic clearances and then there's ground diplomatic clearances. So we got the flight diplomatic clearance just fine. So transferred into that other country, and then we landed, and we were picking up a DV en route to go to another country, and we landed, and as soon as we opened the door, typically we wouldn't have any issues, but at this particular country, customs was right outside the door, and they wanted to take a look at the aircraft. Of course, some of the electronic equipment that we have in there and whatnot is a bit sensitive, so we didn't want them to go in there. So it ended up being a little bit of a rat race with the State Department, getting the State Department out to the airfield, and then at the same time trying to take care of the DV and his staff at the same time. So it ended up being about a 5-hour ordeal by the time everything was said and done to get back. So I would say figuring out country-wise, specifically in the CENTCOM AOR, because you have some countries that are friendly to Israel, some that aren't. So some countries will let you go to Israel straight from their country, some will not. So you have to take all that into all that into your flight planning. So luckily I had, at the time, I had a really good staff and really good colleagues that would help out to make sure that all the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted. So I would say that was probably the biggest hurdle in terms of my UC-35 deployment. Probably the other one I would probably say is would be language barriers. So English is not a first language for many air traffic controllers. So until you really got the run of the mill of what they wanted, so it would be two pilots there, and each one of us would look at each other and go, "Do you know what they said?" "No, I don't know what they said." So then you would ask again and again and again until you got the answer that that you thought was right, and then you went with it.
And without getting into too many of the specifics of like the actual systems, could you provide some context of what the UC-35 was and what kind of the mission set was?
Sure. It was it's DV transport. That's that's its main mission. So essentially, we would haul. Mainly, it was the RSync commander. So is who we would haul, or his staff, or when he or she. So because it keeps switching hands, obviously, when they weren't. When they weren't in town, then it would be just opened up to any DV or any mission set. It wasn't always DVs that we would haul. So all that was controlled through what they called an AMR cell. So
Awesome. And so then, on a different note, what was your experience as a liaison officer during Hurricane Harvey like?
So it's interesting, that dynamic, specifically going from the reserves and then the Guard before that. So the Guard obviously has they have two mandates. They have a federal mandate, then they have a state mandate. So in that capacity, I was, in the state mandate. So it was mutual aid to another state that needed help. So in this case, the state of Texas. So my job was to talk to coordinate with Texas in terms of resources that we had available out there. So we had two Blackhawks, and we had a maintenance detachment that was out there as well, and what services we could offer the state of Texas. So we were based out of Austin, which was nice because that's where their command and control was. So that was really good in terms of getting to the people that needed to be talked to. So we weren't talking to like three people. We were talking to the TAG staff. So and the SAO staff, the state aviation officers staff in Texas and whatnot, and telling them what we needed to do. The one thing that I learned, I was a brand new first lieutenant at the time. Was kind of my first push out of the training environment into something operational, and it really it hits home when it's Americans that you're helping. So you're helping your own people in your own land and whatnot. And I mean, I flew in and out of Houston on the civilian side as a civilian aviator for years. So, but it's something else when you're flying over these same neighborhoods that you would fly over and they're completely flooded out, or you're taking medical supplies and dropping them off at hospitals. Or I remember one particular instance where I was we were out to Orange, Texas, and one of the passengers that was being hauled, he just had the clothes on his back, and that was it. Everything else was underwater. So it really definitely hit home in terms of here we are, another state, so but we're still the United States, and we're going to help them out in the best way that we can.
And then how did that stateside mission really transfer to like a downrange thing? Did you kind of see similarities, or was it kind of a different game?
No, it's the same, but I mean, it's in terms of from a communication aspect, obviously, you don't have the language barriers, you don't have as much of the cultural barriers as we did when we went into CENTCOM. So that part was easier, but at the same time, we're all human. So, and you want to help out, even flying into different areas of CENTCOM and whatnot. At the end of the day, everybody's human. So you need to treat them, as such. So that's kind of the big kicker is and the big similarities, I think, between the two.
And you started off helicopters for the Army, then moved fixed wing to the Army, and then fixed wing for the Air Force.
Yes.
So that the helicopters for the Army is kind of out there. The fixed wing for the Air Force is obviously out there. But I feel like the fixed wing for the Army is a little bit unknown. That's a pretty niche area. Could you kind of speak to that?
Yeah, so the main purpose, so everything in Army aviation is to support the ground commander. So it's not air superiority like it is on the Air Force side. And part of that obviously is, an assault and medevac, which is the helicopter, the Black Hawk, the attack side, which is the Apache. But then you roll into fixed wing, and fixed wing has the C-12, which the C-12 either is a DV side, so you're hauling staff, or you're hauling commanders from, different portions of the theater. So in the UC-35 handles that as well. The other thing that the C-12 does is its intelligence gathering, its ISR capability. So
awesome.
So just on that note, since you've flown so many different aircraft, which one would you say was the most unique?
I would probably say the Black Hawk. So the versatility of the Black Hawk, some of the places where specifically even in the training environment, you're flying around and, you'd have an instructor pilot say, hey, land here. And you're like, dude, there's no way we're going to be able to land there. And sure enough, we land there. With the other thing that I liked about the Black Hawk is the crew dynamic is you have two crew chiefs in the back, or you have a flight medic, depending on if you're flying medevac or not. But typically I was in an assault platoon, so it was all crew chiefs. But that crew dynamic, without the crew chiefs, to be honest with you, they're the ones that are yelling at me, hey, you're 10 feet from a tree, you're 20 feet from a tree, from your blades hitting a tree, whatnot. So they're giving me ground call outs. They're giving me terrain and obstruction call outs all the way down. I couldn't do it without them. Specifically, when you throw on a pair of NVGs, and now you're trying to, you have no perceptual vision at all with NVGs, and you're trying to figure out how far you are above the ground. Now there's some aids specifically with the M model, the UH-60 mic model, which I only flew the Alpha Lima, so I flew the old ones. But the newer technology, there's some stuff in there that helps, but still at the end of the day, it's those crew chiefs that are telling you everything and whatnot. So that was definitely kind of a pivotal moment, I think, in my aviation career. Is like, wow, like the whole safety of the flight is not just hinging on the pilots up front anymore. There's people in the back that definitely are playing the key role in getting that aircraft safely on the ground or landing into those tight spots.
And so the Black Hawk is more of like this spec ops, boots on the ground type of mission set, whereas like the C-12 you were talking about, DV transport, and then the UC-35 and the way that you flew it was also the transport. What was the difference? What was that biggest difference between those mission sets, and kind of how did they play into each other?
I would say probably between the Black Hawk was both. I guess we'll start out with the similarities. Time on target is huge. So everything in the Black Hawk, we were trying for plus or minus 30 seconds either way. So, and to be honest with you, when it came to DV missions, it was sort of the same way. So we wanted to be at a certain time, at a certain point. We wanted to drop them off or pick them up because the logistics of, a lot of times you had a personal security detail or that type of stuff, and the logistics of meeting all of those criteria, they wanted it at a certain time, and we were there at a certain time. So that was where the differences are. The differences between, the similarities. The differences between the two is definitely, I would say, on the assault side specifically, is how to. I'm trying to throw this into the correct wording, but working with a lot of people that aren't very versed in aviation. So you're dealing with infantry, officers, infantry, enlisted, for instance, and hauling them around. So making sure that they're safe, for instance. Obviously the helicopter's got a lot of spinning, parts and whatnot that can hurt people and that type of thing. Making sure that when you're landing, especially if you're landing in an austere environment, that you're, that they're going out the correct door, because you might be landing on a hill, and if they go the other way, they might get close to the rotor, that type of stuff. So kind of dealing with those entities, usually on the DV side, they were very versed. They do it quite a bit. So it was a lot more, laid back, I guess, in that sense. And then I wouldn't say I wouldn't let my guard down by any stretch of the imagination, but for the most part, people kind of knew what we were doing. They had an expectation, and it was always, we were trying to always exceed that expectation.
And that's kind of the nature of the mission too, where Spec Ops is extremely versatile.
Yeah.
And the DV visits, they kind of got to go to the same C2 nodes.
Right.
Yeah.
So you talked about working with like different, people in different career fields. So you served like as an assistant intelligence officer. How did that translate into your aviation career as well?
So there's a lot of parallels, which at first when I was just like, oh, Intel sounds very fun, let's just go into it, But, in terms of planning is the big thing. So in trying to get all the information that you can. So to make that plan, or to put those, to put that intelligence, to put those intelligence reports together. So there's IPB, intelligence preparation of the battlefield is what we call it on the Intel side. So where you're trying to give the commander a picture of what's going on in the AOR, what's either depending or in at least in their scale of their AOR, and that type of thing. So it relates over to the flight side. It's very relevant in terms of pre-flight planning. You're getting weather, how are the airports, NOTAMs, that type of stuff. It's kind of the same thing in terms of, you're plotting different, enemy positions or those types of things on the intelligence side. So there's a lot of similarities. All of it is just information gathering.
And then with that, you served as that intelligence officer in the Operation Cryptic Dragon. Kind of what can you tell us about that operation and how did that influence your career?
Sure. So we were out at Kadena. So we got the TDY out there, and the best part about it is so it's typically a couple of it's to support Operation Talisman Sabre, which is multinational. So involves a lot of our Pacific partners and whatnot. So this is just kind of a subset onto that. And from that aspect, I would tell you that working with other countries, specifically that your allies, is first and foremost, it's fun. I'm not going to lie to you. We had a good time. But the second thing about it is that you learn a commonality between the two in terms of that people have more in common than differences. So that would be the biggest thing that I learned from that. The other thing too is it was a real switch. This was 2019, so the switch from counterinsurgency over to near peer was just starting, and this was kind of my first taste of that. So that when I was going through school and when I was going through flight school and all that, everything was geared towards coin, and then going towards this side of the house now in terms of near peer, and now. Hey, your GPS can get knocked out and get jammed and some other things, and whatnot that goes on from the near peer side that we didn't really have to worry about in counterinsurgency. So that was the big wake-up call in terms of from my edification in terms of I need to know more about this.
And without getting into too many details, what were the kind of design changes or philosophy changes that met with that near peer adversary, like different mission set?
It would be that we're not going to have, we need to go back to low tech, we need to go back to basics is a lot of it. So without getting into too much detail, it's, how we fly plan, how we navigate, that type of stuff. Like the GWIS systems that we have are not going to be there, or might not be there, and that type of thing. So we need to learn how to drive on without that, and still be effective.
And then kind of where your career is at now, you're now an instructor down at the glorious 94th, and of which I love. And so how do you bring so much aviation knowledge and such a diverse aviation experience, and what are you trying to impart on the instructors down at the 94th?
A couple of things. I mean, first of all is decision making. So is the big thing. And that's what I love about the glider. So is the glider forces people to make decisions. You do not have an engine for a redo. You really don't. So you've got to live with the decision that you made. So if you decide to do another 360 and you're getting more sync than you thought you were going to get, well, guess what? You're going to be on low on approach. Did you allow yourself enough buffer, in order to make it to the SPLA or the runway or whatever you're going? So I love the decision making because in life, sometimes you don't have do-overs. So, and that type of thing. And especially when you get into a leadership position, there's decisions that I made as a leader that I knew that we couldn't go back once we did it. And so that's one thing I wanted to try to impart, I guess, on the instructor pool out at the 94th or just the cadet wing in general is sometimes, and I think the glider is a good avenue for that. The other thing too is that the glider is actually very hard to fly, believe it or not. So, people get the hang of it and whatnot, but we get so used to these advanced systems, autopilots, that type of thing. They're in some of these aircraft, and then you get somebody out, and now they're hand flying, and hand flying is perishable, guys. So it's a skill that you might rock it right now, but then you do a year or two, or you do 6 months, and you're not hand flying anymore, and then you try to hand fly. It's a bit of work. Your scan's not there anymore. Where you're looking, what your perceptual, what your all that's gone. So so that's the other thing that I try to teach out there is like, hey, this is the most raw, realistic flying that you're going to get. That's not going to be aided by autopilot, auto throttle. That's not going to be aided by any type of navigation.
So what do you think like the future of the aviators look like? Do you see more hand like stick and throttle pilots, or are we, because technology is not going to stop advancing?
Sure. I would say, and this is kind of the interesting part about, I work for a legacy carrier as an instructor, and one of the things that the FAA is stressing right now and the industry is stressing right now is a flight path first mentality, which is knowing what your aircraft's doing, but then also getting back into the basics for hand flying. Because we have, we've had in the past, as a industry, we've had issues with the loss of, like I said, it's a perishable skill. We've had, guys who roll into the sim and they can't hand fly. They're just not used to it and that type of thing. So it doesn't matter, I guess, how well the automation is. At the end of the day, if there's a set of controls in front of you, as a pilot, you should be able to at least fly that aircraft and get it to a safe position. Because sometimes garbage in, garbage out when it comes to automation. Sometimes the computers aren't going to do what they want. So depending on the adversary, they can get into that software. So and have you fly the wrong way, they can spoof your GPS. You name it, they can do it. So.
And kind of before we move on to the future of the Air Force, I got another question. You've spent the majority of your career doing this, the military aviation, and now you're flying civilian as well. What's kind of the differences, and are you trying to bring any lessons from each into each other?
Sure. And I would say, to correct you, so I did everything civilian first. And then I got my flight slot in the Army at 33, so I was in on an age waiver. So I flew the vast majority of my career, I guess, as a civilian before I went to the military, which brings a different perspective going through a full, 141 civilian, going to a regional carrier as a first officer, then a captain, then going to the Army, and whatnot. So I would say the biggest thing is. And I guess would be the differences between the two. The Air Force and the airlines are a completely different operation. Obviously, we have a different mentality as an Air Force, as an Air Force pilot. So as an Army aviator, so different mission set. What we're doing is completely different. The airline side's very operational based, a lot of interfacing between different groups, so your flight attendants, your customer service agents, that type of stuff. And then also it's run like a business. So there's a lot of efficiency matrix and whatnot that we have to meet that on the Air Force side, I wouldn't say, efficiency is important even on the military side, don't get me wrong, money's money. But at the same time, it's, there's that dichotomy between the two is a little different.
And so we've kind of hit on it, your variety of experience, both in the Army, Air Force, Reserve, National Guard. So as someone with a bit more inside knowledge on like this total force concept, how do you see that being used in this near-peer adversary conflict?
Well, I think if there is a conflict of any sort and it's near peer, it's going to take a lot more resources than what we had during Iraq or Afghanistan. I mean, we had surges and whatnot during both conflicts. And whatnot, but it's going to take, and during both those conflicts, the reserves and the Guard were in the rotations, just like active duty was. So I would see something that's similar to that. Where I think on the total force side, where there might be some differences, is there's efficiencies and whatnot that I learned, since most of the people, if they're not AGR or whatever, that's on the reserve side or the National Guard side, most people are traditional reservists. So they come in, they do their, it's a little bit more for pilots. It's a lot more than, 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year, that the recruiters always tell you. But the amount of civilian knowledge that's brought in, because a lot of these individuals work they work in the same industry. So there's, when I was at Papago on the helicopter, there was a lot of guys and gals that worked in aerospace or They worked for McDonnell Douglas helicopter was down the road, that type of stuff. So they're bringing their civilian knowledge and trying to help the operation. So I think that's a huge plus in the total force concept in terms of aiding active duty, where this is the only thing that active duty does. First of all, aiding that, but also injecting ideas and practices and best practices that we have in the industry. So for efficiencies. So because I can tell you right now that if we have a large near peer conflict, it's going to take a lot of resources, and we're going to have to be efficient with our resources, both our manpower and our air power, but also equipment, you name it. So and whatnot. And I think there's a lot of areas on the civilian side where companies are used to doing that. So they're used to that's how companies survive. So we can impart that knowledge and help out the military in that aspect.
Did you see a lot of collaboration between the sister service aviation aspects, like downrange, at least in Kuwait?
Yes. So it was it was great being on an Air Force installation. So down there, and in terms of I had a very good relationship with the group that was down there, and whatnot. And then the other expeditionary forces that were out there as well. And it was in terms of, I learned a lot because there's Army-isms, there's Air Force-isms, and whatnot. So, they would be talking and I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that's what this means on the Army side, that type of thing. So, no, it was that part was a great experience, was working with, well, not only Air Force, obviously, like we were hosted on an air base. That was great, but also working with Navy, Marine Corps. A lot of the liaisons for the air traffic controllers in Kuwait was our Army, because they're out of Jabber. So it's Army, Navy. So it was so working with them and whatnot. And then a lot of our spare parts, the Marine Corps also fly the UC-35. So we would work with Navy, Marine Corps quite a bit to get spare parts if we didn't have the parts and we didn't want to fly them in from somewhere else.
And that's talking a lot about that efficiency matrix that you can bring in from the
Yeah.
civilians. That's cool.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
Just hitting more on like the importance of like diversity of perspectives. Do you have any like personal examples of where you've maybe come in as like an outsider and been able to contribute to the mission in a different way?
Yeah, I mean, definitely coming in from a lot of, and it's interesting because on the UC-35 community on the Army Reserve side is a lot of pilots. So a lot of civilian pilots, and a lot of them are airlines now. When I started, it wasn't as many airline pilots as there are now. So in terms of bringing some of the efficiencies of how flows and checklists are done, for instance, and that type of thing, and that we would all sit around. Now, mainly that was the warrant officer standardization side that would help out on that, but I'd give input where I could. I'm like, well, on the airline side, this is what we've been doing. I don't know if this is going to work here. The other thing that I try to impart, and this kind of comes back to my safety side, is really working in the risk management piece. So, and risk management on the military side it's very robust. Don't get me wrong. But at the time, and we're talking 5-6 years ago now, it was a part of Army aviation, but it probably wasn't at the forefront as much as it probably could have been. So I definitely imparting the risk management concepts specifically down to the pilot level, and how we think and that type of thing, and using threat and error management, that type of stuff.
And so the new technological advance, kind of on this risk management theme, the new technological advancements from the Air Force and et cetera, and just aviation in general, part of it is to mitigate like safety risks, to like autopilot is to aid the pilot so that they're not task saturated. How do you see pilot training, like specifically Air Force pilot training, change with advancements being made in technology, especially if we're trying to get back to those fundamental stick and throttle days?
Sure. I mean, I do think from a cost saving standpoint, there's probably going to be more simulators. I think that's a given. We see that obviously on the civilian side, where we can have, you can have somebody start at an airline, and the first flight that they fly is with passengers. We're not flying empty aircraft around. That's different than when I first started at that regional carrier. So we couldn't do single engine approaches and landing, if I remember correctly. So we actually had to take an empty aircraft out middle of the night, and we flew down and did that. So where we just threw one back to idle and went after it. Now the simulators, the fidelity is so good that we can do that. So I see on the Air Force side probably more simulation. There's in terms of the retirement of the T1, retirement of the T6s, that's all public knowledge. So
Rest in peace.
Yes, exactly. So and it's in all honesty, it looks like both of them look like a blast to fly. So obviously I went a different avenue than that, but I would say that more simulator based, but at the same time, one thing the simulator can't teach is, you have initial startle. So whenever you have an event, or even if it's like a simulated engine failure, for instance, there's still a startle. So and whatnot, and your situational awareness does one of these. So and it goes to like nothing, and then you'll start to build your essay again. But you have that initial shock whenever anything like that happens. So the simulator, we try it on the airline side, and people are still startled by it, and we have first looks and that kind of stuff where we won't brief what we're doing, but then at the same time, people know when they enter the simulator that, yeah, we're going to get something like if it's quiet in the sim, it's like, okay, what's next? And they're expecting it. Obviously, we're not going to fly an aircraft that way. So, it's hard to train that in a simulator. So I think that's where the real aircraft needs to come in. You talk about the other thing that it can't simulate is very well is the ATC environment and, changes in the weather. It can simulate weather really good, but it can't simulate being task saturated because there's a million aircraft in this airspace, and you need to kind of deconflict, or even when you're downrange or something like that, and you get a weird clearance, and now you're trying to talk to air traffic control, and there's a language barrier there, and that type of thing. Like, what are we going to do in that situation? So, we got a little bit of training when we did our RIP downrange on that kind of stuff. It worked out really well. In the real aircraft, we couldn't simulate that in a simulator. I can tell you that.
It's hard to simulate that human aspect of the flying, especially with other pilots in the air.
Yes.
Yeah.
So switching on to like your education and background, just working with the National Transportation Safety Board, what did you learn from that experience?
And then also for context, what is the National Transportation Safety Board?
So the National Transportation Safety Board it's a government entity. There's about 400 individuals that are in there. The vast majority of them work on aviation accidents. So, and they wear the white hat. So essentially, like, their whole purpose is not to find fault, but to investigate accidents and to make recommendations to either the FAA or the industry, or to Congress, in terms of what we can do to make aviation safer. So part of it is an accident side of the house. The other part of it is being proactive, and they'll look at, if they start seeing trends or something like that, they might make a recommendation based off of those trends as well.
And then do those recommendations turn into laws, or do they turn into FAA regulations? Like, how does that implemented to actually change?
They can.
Okay.
So yeah, it's up to the FAA or it's up to Congress. With enough support, typically stuff can get pushed over the finish line.
And then harken back to that first question, like, what have you learned from it? What's kind of the big trends that you've seen? What's the big...
It's interesting because, so that started as an internship, and so I was in college right after 9/11. So, and I wanted an airline internship like everybody else from Embry-Riddle. That was an aeronautical science degree I wanted to do. And so 2002, I started looking through the books for, and started calling the airlines, and none of the airlines had internships because they were all cutting back funds. So there was no internships going on. And I was a safety minor, so I took one safety class at the time. So I was right at the beginning of my safety minor, and I was like, started looking through it. I was like, oh, NTSB, I'll just throw my name in the hat. You never know. So, and sure enough, I got it. So based off of that, to be honest with you, that was, you talk about taking those leaps in life. So when you're young and just don't know what's going to play out on that. And I'll be honest with you, the NTSB was probably one of the most impactful. things that ever happened to me from from a professional standpoint. I learned a lot of things. Well, first of all, is that accident investigation can be gruesome. So, which obviously it can be. So you're dealing with. But the other thing is the human aspect of it. So the empathy that needs to be behind it. You're doing this to try to make aviation safety better. You're not doing this to lay blame. So that's what I loved about it, was the white hat portion of the NTSB, to where, I'm not looking at this to fry somebody or to build a case against somebody it's some of these guys and gals that, you investigate their accidents, and they were great pilots, but they just made a bad mistake. And it doesn't mean that they were a bad pilot. They were a great pilot up until that point. And then they made a mistake, or something happened with the aircraft, one or the two. So what it learned was, what I learned on that one is empathy. I learned grace a little bit on that. The other thing I learned too is attention to detail. And I know that they harp on you guys for attention to detail out here at the Hill all the time, right? So, but it's super important. I can't reiterate that enough to you guys in terms of the attention to detail, because when you're looking at an accident, and I was doing accidents, mostly general aviation accidents, where they didn't have flight recorders. So it's not like we can just plug and play and be like, okay, this is what the aircraft's doing. So now you're looking at clues, you're looking at, I remember one accident site that I did in Utah where, we were trying to figure out 6 ways to Sunday how this aircraft impacted the terrain. And then we look up and there's a piece of a nav light against a rock. So that's where we know that that was the first impact, there was a green lens from a nav light, and that type of thing. So it's that attention to detail. If we didn't do a scan of that whole area, we never would have found that. So I worked with some great investigators that were out there. Some are still out there, which is great, and whatnot. And what I learned too is that any type of immortality complex that I had in my mid-20s was completely out the door my first week out there. And it made me a lot more serious about flying, and a lot more serious about getting into. That's why on the master's side I got into proactive and predictive risk management so much. Is not only do I want to investigate why these things happen, but let's prevent them, or let's start looking at trending to see how we can prevent accidents from occurring again.
And at least from like the soaring aspect, I know that learning any aviation comes with a lot of mistakes, and kind of on the risk management side, those mistakes can be a lot more dangerous than expected. How do you bounce back from that? How have you seen pilots, like you mentioned, good pilots who just made a mistake? How do you bounce back from that?
Well, part of it is learning. Part of it is the education piece. I think part of that is, honestly, in terms of why I continue to instruct, is to continue to tell, new pilots or old pilots, over at the airline, for instance, and to tell those stories. So, I was told once that, a pilot can't make every mistake. So you've got to learn from others, and whatnot. And that's where, there's some value in, for instance, the cockpit confessions that people do, that the Air Force does, for instance, where everybody's kind of talking out their stories and that type of thing. That's why that's so important, and whatnot. It's to try to get students into a risk management mind frame. And it's the same thing when you get out into the leadership world as well, in terms of you're going to make decisions and you're going to weigh out the risks. You're going to weigh out the risks and the rewards. What does it do in terms of, from a, accelerating your mission, or the mission that has been given to you. So, and how much risk is there, and at your level, are you willing to accept that risk?
So just talking about that mission and like the risk level, you also discussed like the importance of empathy and grace. Like, how does that also balance out?
So I think at the end of the day, like if you come in with, and I try to be a glass half full type of guy. So if you come in that everybody, specific on the military side, everybody that wears the uniform, or even on the airline side, everybody's trying to come in and they're trying to learn to be better. If you come in with that, as opposed to, I don't, that person, I don't, think that they're worthy or whatever. Like that's the wrong. I look at it as everybody, first of all, specifically let's talk military, everybody took an oath. So like everybody signed on the dotted line. So right there, I give everybody credit. And my hope is that as they get through different courses or curriculum that, more or less that's putting their bar higher. So when they come to me, or if I get them as an instructor, when I get you guys as an instructor down at the airfield, I'm looking at it as you guys are trying to get better. So you might have a really bad flight, but I'm gonna have the empathy to at least try to see it from your side of the house. Maybe there might be, somebody's taking 4 or 5 classes up here on the hill and they're really hard, or something like that. So your head might not be completely in it, that type of stuff. And then try to give you some antidotes in order to try to overcome those. So and whatnot, and try to get some resilience in there so that next time you can do better.
You've been immersed in aviation pretty much what it seems like for a very significant portion of your life. Where'd that start? Why did you always want to become a pilot?
Yeah, well, it's kind of funny. So my dad was retired chief. So he was a B-52 crew chief for many years in SAC. So this was well before I was born. So I was born towards the tail end of, actually he was like 1 or 2 years retired. So I would say the tail end of his Air Force career. He was a contractor at that point. And so I was around airplanes. So, and then took a flight in 1989. I kind of remember it like it was yesterday. So well before you guys were even close to being around here. And it was a United Airlines flight from Denver to Washington Dulles, and I was sold. And it was kind of funny because I can credit my parents to the fact that I was the one that was at the soccer game when I was supposed to be kicking the ball, and I'm looking up watching planes on shore final and that type of thing. So my parents encouraged me to get my private pilot's certificate when I was in high school. So I actually got it up at Centennial. So and I got it my junior year going into my senior year of high school. So kind of it was interesting because I was at my high school reunion a couple weeks ago. That's how old I am, I guess. But I had a buddy of mine come up to me and he's like, "You're the only one who said you were going to be a pilot, and or be something, and you're actually that. Everybody else is." He's like, "It's amazing." And I could have told you, like 12-year-old Jimmy could have told you that I was going to be in the military, because at that time I really wanted to be in the military, and that I was going to be a pilot. So and it's I guess here I am today, right?
Yeah. Can you kind of talk about that, because you were 33 when you joined the military? What was the delay? What was the process like?
So it was something I wanted to do. What I wanted to do was my 20 years in the Air Force. So obviously follow my dad's footsteps, and then get out and then have my lucrative career or whatever at the 121 world as an airline guy. I started going, looking at it, and at the time my vision was 2300 uncorrected. And the regulation didn't catch up yet. So even with PRK and with LASIK and whatnot, there was no way I was going to fly in the military. So had a pretty good mentor that was friends with my dad, and he's like, "You know what, you should go the civilian route." So and then maybe it might clear up one of these days. So 28, 29, so it started to look better. The regulation started to, both on the Army side and the Air Force side, were looking pretty good for me to actually make the jump to a reserve unit or a guard unit. And then I aged out on the Air Force side. So started rushing units and whatnot. And I hit 30, and they're like, "There's no waivers, no UPT. Your dream is done." And I was at a safety conference actually with a colleague of mine, and he's like, "You ever thought about flying in the Army for the Guard?" And I'm like, "No." And he's like, I was like, "I talked to a recruiter once," and he's like, "Yeah, don't talk to them." He's like, "Let me give you the name of somebody." So it actually ended up being a really prominent person actually in Arizona. So it was the assistant to the state aviation officer. So cold emailed him, and he called me like 20 minutes later, and ended up boarding for a Blackhawk slot, and then actually it was registered for Apache slot, and that's right. And then he got to know me a little bit better. He seemed more like a Blackhawk guy, and I'm like, I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but lo and behold, that's how that's how I ended up over on the Army side.
That's awesome. You want to finish it off?
Yeah, so just a common tradition to end the podcast. In your opinion, what is the best aircraft in the Air Force or Army's inventory, and why?
Yep.
So
we'll go. How about we go one from each?
Okay,
Yeah.
we can do one from each. You're going to give me one because, to be honest with you, I mean, on the Air Force side, I don't know if I can tell you on one. I mean, the versatility of like the Black Hawk / Pavok. I mean, obviously the Air Force has the Pavok variant. Some of the Pavok guys that I met down at Davis Monthan, really awesome group. Not going to lie to you. I would say the versatility for the Pavok and the Black Hawk. So the B-52, my dad was a crew chief on it for 15 years. So, I mean, something that's still flying after all these years and is still as potent and, it's still awe-inspiring when those flyovers come over from B-52s. And then to be honest with you, probably the one aircraft on the Air Force arsenal that's probably saved many of my brethren's lives is the A-10. So, and whatnot. So, I actually have a deep affinity for them. I lived in Tucson for years. And talking with a lot of the infantry soldiers when I was in the Army side, they went downrange and whatnot, and the difference between life or death was typically an A-10. So definitely saved a lot of lives over the years. So I think, I know I was supposed to choose one, but I'm gonna exercise my option and do more.
Love planes.
Yes.
That's what I love to hear. Awesome. Well, that has been episode 33 of the Flyover Podcast. You can find all of the long-form content on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and then all of our short-form clips can be found on Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts. We'll see you next time.